Central Asia, that was published by Cornell in 2014, and certainly numerous papers and edited volumes. Some of them you surely know because our students like your papers. So it's not only me or Mateusz, but a lot of other people there, and Anya, that distribute your works among our students. She has also, there is also an edited volume of Madeleine and Mateusz that we have here, Affective States, Entanglements, Suspensions, Suspicions, O20S. And her more recent special issue is Marginal Hubs, Conviviality Beyond Urban Center in Asia. That's the most recent publication, as I figured out, because it was published in 2019. In our library, we have two books, two edited volumes of Madeleine Reeves, so that you can take a look at them and maybe borrow.
And Mateusz has a chapter in the other one as well.
Yeah. Okay. We are honored that you agreed to come to Warsaw, and we are happy to have you here. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ivona, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Mateusz, especially for being a long-term collaborator, and it's really, really a great pleasure to be here and to present some research here. The paper that I'm going to present today is, in a sense, it's a bit of a side project. With the Brexit referendum in the UK in 2016, like a lot of my colleagues, I became very interested in thinking about particular political forms. And there was a lot of debate in the UK about the nature of a referendum. And what was interesting to me is that a lot of this conversation was happening in rather different ways in Kyrgyzstan, a place where I had been doing research since the early 2000s. So this paper is about Kyrgyzstan rather than about the UK, but some of the questions around what referendums do and don't create and how they get used to mobilize certain ideas about the people are some of the kind of ideas that are underlying this paper. I'm going to read the paper in the interests of time, so I'll fire away. In September 2014, the History Department of Kyrgyzstan's National University welcomed delegates to a conference dedicated to assessing the legacy of perestroika in Central Asia. It was a formal occasion, officially the 25th anniversary of 1989, bookended with official speeches by politicians who had been active in the Republic's political life a generation earlier. Although I was there to present my research, I found myself the unexpected object of address during one of the opening speeches. Turning to me as our English guest, the 75-year-old former First Secretary of the Kyrgyz Communist Party, Medetkan Sherimkulov, who you can see here on your left, spoke of some breaking news of which he had just learned and which he wanted to share with the auditorium. In the referendum on Scottish independence, he announced, that had been held the previous day, the result was just in. Scottish voters, he told the auditorium, had narrowly voted to remain within the United Kingdom. Now, although this was a conference that had nothing to do with Scotland and nothing to do with the UK, it was about perestroika in Central Asia, he wanted to, as he put it, publicly congratulate me on this fortunate result, as he described it. And he invited me to address the gathered students, who you can see here on the right, on the importance of national unity. After all, he explained, recent events showed that Kyrgyzstan knew only too well what he called the scourge of separatism, an oblique allusion to intercommunal violence that had affected Kyrgyzstan's two largest southern cities in 2010. Linking the Scottish independence referendum to the theme of the conference, he then turned to the rows of seated undergraduates. How might world events have turned out differently if in 1989 Gorbachev hadn't ceded to the Baltic Republic's own separatist demands, he asked, in so doing setting off a chain of events that had led to the disintegration of that great state, Великое государство, the Soviet Union? How will you, he then challenged the students, work to defend Kyrgyzstan's statehood, its государственность? Shcherenkulov's unexpected invitation to address the gathered students left me searching for words. I had been agnostic on the question of Scottish independence, a ballot in which I was not entitled to vote because I was a resident of England rather than Scotland. Nor did I share his stark assessment of the risks of regional separatism in Kyrgyzstan. I fumbled some non-committal words about democratic participation, noting that in a context where young people tend not to participate much in the electoral process, it was refreshing to observe how Scottish 16 and 17-year-olds had been politicised by the referendum debate. Whatever the result, I commented, skirting around the question of the outcome, the referendum had been an important exercise in popular democracy. I didn't think much more about Shcherenkulov's comments or my hesitant response until 2.5 years later, I came to share a meal with 22-year-old Venera, one of the undergraduate students who had been in the audience of students that day. It was March 2017, and I had briefly returned to Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan's capital. 3 months earlier, in December 2016, Kyrgyzstani citizens had taken part in a referendum to pass a slate of amendments to the country's constitution, its 6th constitutional referendum in 25 years of independence. Venera had been active in the sizable activist community, Referendum нет, no to the referendum, that had mobilised to argue against changing the constitution, sharing links and likes on the group's Facebook pages. She was fired up by this experience of online activism. Even though the referendum result, an 80% vote in favour of the constitutional changes, was a source of bitter disappointment to her. This referendum wasn't about true democracy, she told me over our meal in Bishkek. It was the work of unnamed aferisti, as she put it, con artists, who played upon social upheaval. This wasn't democracy, she said, but sayasat. She used here the Kyrgyz term for politics, even though she was speaking in Russian. She spat out the word like a curse. Venera's emphatic disdain for the electoral process was far from unique among my informants. In Kyrgyzstan, during 25 years of independence, there have been multiple attempts at refounding the political order through constitutional change. The most recent iteration, the 2016 referendum, that was the focus of Venera's ire, approved in a single yes-no vote a bundle of 26 changes to the preceding 2010 constitution, which had in turn been introduced following a period of enduring social and political crisis in the 2000s, when the state itself had been close to collapse. The 2010 constitution, the object of intense deliberation and public debate, had authorised a fundamental change to the country's system of governance, from a presidential to a parliamentary system. Crucially, moreover, the 2010 version of the Constitution contained a clause prohibiting further amendments to the text of the document until at least 2020. Article 114, as it came to be known, was a clause intended to forestall further reworking of the Constitution and to protect its co-optation by partisan political interests. It was, in this sense, an attempt to build into the very wording of the Constitution a limit on its future unmaking. So the proposed changes in 2016 signalled a return to a more emphatically presidential and centralised mode of governance, as well as a more explicitly ethno-national stress on national values. The revised preamble of the Constitution, for instance, stressed the importance of, quote, developing and strengthening Kyrgyz statehood, Kyrgyzsku государственность, protecting state sovereignty and the unity of the people, developing its language and culture as, quote, the highest goal of the Constitution. Revisions to individual articles sought to diminish the power of the judiciary by subjecting decisions of the Constitutional Chamber to the approval of the President and Parliament, and increasing the regulatory and monitoring powers of the security services. Further amendments gave the President the power to appoint and dismiss members of the Constitutional Chamber. One proposed amendment, the one that generated the greatest international attention, explicitly prohibited same-sex marriage. For opponents of the 2016 referendum, such as Viniera, it wasn't just the substance of the amendments that was a source of concern, or the bundling of amendments to 26 distinct articles into a single ballot. It was also the fact that the existing 2010 constitution would be undermined in the very act of holding a referendum before the 10-year moratorium on further reworkings was over. As our meal came to an end, Viniera reminded me of the comments that I had made 2.5 years previously at this conference in 2014. She challenged me. Remember when you told us about the Scottish independence referendum as being a victory for democracy, she asked, her tone part teasing, part deadly serious. Well, you can put all the stuff that you don't want to debate into a referendum. Put something about national values at the top of the paper and you can get the people to pass anything. I bet half the people didn't even read the ballot. So this section is called Anthropology, Agonism and Political Disavowal. This paper is an attempt to think anthropologically about political disavowal, prompted by Viniera's critique, her implied, although not verbalised, bullshit in response to my anodyne comments about democratic participation, her accusation that this sayasat was a particularly fickle pretense of politics, a world in which con artists parade as the real thing and constitutions can be rewritten on a whim. The realm of politics, of course, is often seen as paradigmatically one of trickery and deceit, or the cunning of unreason, as John Donne called it in his sweeping history of political disillusion. I quote, "All human action lies under the shadow of prospective regret," Donne argues, "but there are few, if any, domains of our acting over which the shadow falls so darkly as it does over the huge and ever more drastically consequential field of politics." End of quote. While few might disagree with Donne's assessment, it's striking, I think, that anthropology has, in general, at least in recent anthropology, had much more to say about moments of political upheaval and perhaps of political hope than with political refusal or disavowal. Perhaps this is because of the ethnographic seduction of those times and places when politics takes over the street, and a barricade sociality, as Zinowska and Arenas put it, consumes and momentarily transforms the body politic, making the people aware of itself as an ephemeral subject of politics. In the study of post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan, political activism has garnered considerable ethnographic interest. Insightful analyses of protest movements and their leaders, of sit-ins and road closures, of the dynamics of localism in opposition movements, of student activism, and the social and emotional intensity of electoral participation. Such moments perhaps resonate with our own anthropological hope, that ordinary people might truly be the authors of their own political futures, that unloved political leaders can be toppled from their thrones. But what of political exhaustion? Much less, I think, has been written about the desire for non-politics, about the refusal to vote, to protest, or to take one's discontent to the streets, or the desire not to hold a ballot, or the refusal to take part in one. We know, I think, comparatively little about wariness towards political antagonism, or the forms it takes, particularly after barricades have been dismantled and crowds dispersed, or about the shapes of political exhaustion after a period of devastating intercommunal violence has undone the dense fabric of relations in an ethnically mixed city. And yet, over the 2 decades that I have been conducting research in Kyrgyzstan, moments of dramatic political upheaval, though they are many, have occurred in a context where the more commonly articulated concern is for political order and durability, of keeping the government, the parliament, and the state itself going in the face of multiple internal and external pressures. It's such a concern for stability, I suggest, that was written into the 2010 Constitution through Article 114 that prohibited further constitutional amendments. And it was this that made the 2016 referendum so contentious. It's also, I think, such a concern that animates calls for harmony in Kyrgyz Undlamak as perhaps the foundational virtue of civic life. For Undlamak is, above anything else, a curb on political and social agonism. A harmony ideology, as Beyer and Gürke put it, premised on the recognition that living together sometimes demands that dissent remain unvoiced. While the contours of this story are inseparable from the specifics of Kyrgyzstan's recent history, suspicions of political overspill have many global resonances. Venera's cynicism about the true intentions behind an ostensibly democratic act echoes other voices about other elections, including those of anthropologists struggling to make sense of their own political disquiet in the face of divisive balance. Writing in the tense run-up to the Scottish independence referendum in 2014, Jonathan Spencer recalls, quote, the almost claustrophobic sense that there was too much politics, of political antagonisms spilling over into all areas of life, of every casual conversation being framed by the possibility of turning into a bitter political row, not least among close family and dear friends. In Remain voting circles following the UK Brexit referendum in 2016, the sense of betrayal by a political class that cared little for democracy was poignantly captured in Ali Smith's portrait of divisions as they coursed through families and communities, quote, as if a live electric wire had snapped off a pylon in a storm and was whipping about in the air above the trees, the roofs, the traffic. So if elections are premised on irreconcilable difference as the dynamic force of political life, a difference that necessitates mechanisms, however blunt, to channel and arbitrate between political interests, there is, I think, something quite distinctive about the referendum as a tool of political decisionism, one in which anthropology has as yet had relatively little to say. Referendums are typically conducted in the interests of eliciting a moment of political closure through the explicit invocation of the people's will. In this lies both their power and their volatility. In Kyrgyzstan, as in the UK, for instance, it is striking that what crystallized in the wake of the respective referendums in 2016 was often a nagging concern that the political institution itself was not quite to be trusted, that certain questions should better not be put to a popular ballot. This was something other than, or more than, mere disillusion or disappointment. It was the niggling awareness that the ballot itself was a fake, with a fictional choice masquerading as the real deal, hence Venera's diagnosis of sayasat. It's these vernacular diagnoses and their responses that I want to foreground in the analysis that follows, taking both the identification of political failure and its disavowal seriously as properly anthropological objects of inquiry. But it's also, beyond that, an attempt to think about the nature of the referendum as a distinctive kind of political device for conjuring the people. What makes a referendum as distinct from, as a distinct form of decisionism merely politics, in Venera's words? What are the political excesses of which referendums are seen as the symptoms? And what might such moments of diagnosis illuminate about authenticity and duplicity as they circulate as figures of hope and derision in political life? To unpack these ideas, I want to turn a little bit more to the case of Kyrgyzstan and the ambivalent resonances of there being too much sayasat, too much politics. Visitors to Kyrgyzstan will often hear that the country's politics are nothing at all like those of its neighbours. Sometimes this is recounted as a statement of pride or of defiance. Here we can criticise the president, I was often told, but you try doing that in Uzbekistan. Sometimes it's explained as the inheritance of nomadic Kyrgyz culture, which valued freedom and never looked too kindly on overlords. Sometimes it takes the form of self-deprecating jokes or unlikely international records. That Kyrgyzstan, for instance, has amended its constitution more times and in a shorter period than any other state, or that it has had more presidential candidates running in an election per capita than any other state. Whatever the empirical veracity of these claims, their circulation as truth statements is significant. Political failure in Kyrgyzstan is widely identified as a failure of excess. The tone of such observation is often ambivalent. The recognition of greater public freedom, coupled with a lament that Kyrgyzstan lacks a transparent vertical of power, or the oil-powered infrastructural reach of the Kazakhstani and Russian states. In this diagnosis, democracy is less a sign of success, the success of political reforms or institutional transformations or of political culture, than an artifact of failing state reach or a mark of political instability. Both its exceptionalism in the Central Asian context and its extremely unstable recent political history have fostered then a distinctive political sphere in Kyrgyzstan, one in which foundational questions of what it is to be sovereign or independent or democratic, what it means for the state to have the attributes of legitimacy or territorial integrity or constitutionality, or what it should mean, for instance, for the ethnic Kyrgyz to feel themselves to be masters in their own land, are live in everyday conversation and liable to spring to the surface of otherwise routine matters. Public debate over whether Kyrgyzstan should join the Eurasian Customs Union, which it eventually did in August 2015, for instance, was characterised not primarily by concerns regarding the economic advantages and disadvantages of membership, but about whether joining would undermine Kyrgyzstani sovereignty. In 2006, the Kyrgyzstan government had refused to join the World Bank's programme for highly indebted poor countries for the same reason, with politicians and civil society activists alike demonstrating outside the World Bank offices and setting alight a symbolic coffin state to protest the stranglehold on sovereignty that the programme would allegedly entail. Nor is such sovereignty concern confined to the capital city or the political elite. During my fieldwork in southern Kyrgyzstan, I encountered plenty of discussion of bread and butter politics, particularly as this pertained to the relative distribution of wealth between north and south of the country. But what I hadn't anticipated is quite how much sovereignty talk I would encounter. Quite so much commentary on what it was to be or to have or to fail to have territorial integrity, international legibility, and a functioning responsive state to which one is legible and which is in turn legible to the population in the figure of the policeman or pensions or asphalted roads. These questions had an intensity and urgency to them born of recent political crises. In the wake of years of political upheaval, Kyrgyzstani citizens had become accustomed to commentary on their state as a prospective failed state, несостоявшееся государство, or of being unable to sustain parliamentary democracy, as Dmitry Medvedev had notoriously claimed in 2010. And although such external commentary was often dismissed by my urban acquaintances as the ill-informed or condescending attitude of Russian politicians who were unable to accept that other states could determine their own political futures, in rural Batken region in the south, many of my informants seemed to concur with the assessment that elections were just too dangerous, that they risked igniting social tensions that were never far from the surface, setting in motion social antagonisms that couldn't easily be contained. In this context, disavowal, the refusal to participate in demonstrations and strikes, or to give away one's vote for a promise of material reward, are acts, I think, that need to be situated within a register of ethics and sociality, just as much as more demonstrative acts of collective participation do. To illustrate, I'm going to turn to two ethnographic examples from fieldwork a decade apart. The first is from June 2005 in Tozbulak village. School is out and Bakadahai, not his real name, a teacher of Russian language and literature in his late 50s, is in his classroom whitewashing the walls. This is the school where he works. The paint has been paid for by his pupils' parents, and Bakadahai is responsible for overseeing the annual process of remont, or school repairs. He covers up the wall-sized painting of Pushkin, the one that he wanted his photograph taken by, to protect it from splashes of paint, shouting orders to the parents and former pupils who are helping in this annual ritual of renovation. Bakadahai is exhausted, and not just from the endless paper and repair work that consume his summer days. Many of his colleagues have left to work in Russia, and for the first time, he is considering leaving too. He hasn't received his full salary for months, and even with a lengthy teaching service and a double load of classes, it's hard to make ends meet. The new government, he tells me, he's referring here to a government that was installed after revolutionary upheaval in March 2005, doesn't have cash to pay teachers, or so they say. But they have cash to give us before the elections, he commented. In this border village, where tensions over water and land often run close to the surface of daily interaction, election time can be fraught. The last election, 4 months earlier, was followed by street protests in Bishkek and provincial capitals that had seen the overthrow of the then president, Askar Akayev, in a dramatic popular coup. It had also divided Bakadahai's village between those who supported the local candidate in the parliamentary elections and those who favoured the more prominent leaders of the political opposition. At the time of our conversation in 2005, the self-declared leader of the so-called People's Movement of Kyrgyzstan, Kurmanbek Bakiev, had not yet been sworn in as president, and the hastily convened interim government was struggling to contain a wave of looting that had followed the March 2005 overthrow of former President Akayev. It was also struggling to pay state salaries, including Bakadahai's own. In the past, he had already been paid by the start of the holidays, he told me. But in June, he was still awaiting his salary from March. Bakadahai's reflections on these economic woes quickly morphed into a broader commentary on the demands of political participation, particularly in a village such as his, where histories of compulsory resettlement meant that no single lineage, or uru in Kyrgyz, dominated. After the whitewashing was finished for the day, Bakadahai invited me to take a seat at the back of his classroom, where he explained his exhaustion with sayasat through reference to the elections that had taken place earlier that year, precipitating the political crisis that continued to consume the country. And I quote here from the interview that I recorded with him. Here, for instance, he said, people wanted Dosbol Nur Olu as their parliamentary deputy. He's got relatives here, that's why. But he didn't get through, he couldn't get enough votes. Why? Because there were others there in Bakken town he was referring to. They're different from us. They had their own relatives. You see, it's a bad habit we've got, these old holdovers. We've got relatives, you know, you have to know your 7 forefathers. And so Dosbol Nurulu, he has relatives here. But in Bakken town, well, over there, they're Kipchaks. You know Kipchaks, right? And they said they wanted a Kipchak to get through. Usually it's one of those who wins there. But here we're Avat, right? Our lineage is different. And that's important because there are more of them over there in Bakken. Here our lineages are small because inside Avat you've got Tokmok, Bujur, Keje, lots of sub-lineages, 9 of them. And election time we all end up dividing. We've got that kind of mentality. That's how we've survived. The one who's closer, you know, you can trust him more. And then we call this democracy. For Bakadahai, this anxiety about political fragmentation translated into an emphatic refusal to take part in the demonstrations that had been plaguing other parts of the country and of his district since the spring. Some of his relatives indeed had tried to persuade him to come to the district centre, Batken, at election time to voice his support for the new southern leader, Kurmanbek Bakiev. But Bakatarai refused. "I've got children to teach," he commented indignantly of his emphatic non-participation in those rallies. He continued, "If an enemy turns up here, then I'll be ready to fight. But what about those in power? What need have I to fight them? The problem now is that no one even listens to the law any longer. One guy gets into power and they say, he's correct. Another guy gets into power and brings along his own constitution. He's correct. And where's the law in this? Where's the continuity? It's not clear what will happen. Maybe there'll be anarchy in the future, who can say?" Even at a time when others were celebrating the success of a popular uprising in removing President Akayev and his so-called family government, Bakatarai was anticipating the political disillusion that many came to feel only later. Yet his was not just disillusion with corrupt elites. In his account of sayasat, the problem wasn't just the capacity of elections to channel and solidify social divisions that were otherwise muted in daily life, but the ability of those thus elected to appropriate the law in their favour, to the extent that even the constitution is treated as a private document to be changed at whim. As he noted, another guy gets into power and brings along his own constitution. Indeed, these two dimensions of sayasat were, I think, profoundly linked in his account. It was the very tendency for the powerful to appropriate the constitution and then claim in a sleight of hand that this is the will of the people. He's correct, but magnified social tensions by exposing the necessary gap between democracy's promise and its murky realisation. My second ethnographic example comes from another mountain village a decade later. Unlike Toruz-Bulak, Chichme is a Tajik majority village tucked into a mountain gorge and spatially contiguous with a Kyrgyz majority village with which it constitutes a single administrative district. As in villages up and down the country, private buildings on Chichme's central street, which you can see here, have been turned into the local headquarters, the Stab, for the main political parties that are competing here. Fabric banners hang from shop windows to advertise their new role. Here you can see an advert for one of those parties, Ata Meken. As a decade earlier, there are sponsored concerts by visiting pop stars in the local administrative centre 12 kilometres away. There are promises of pay rises and deliveries of coal. School gymnasiums, which will serve as the polling station on election day, are being hastily cleaned ahead of the October 4th elections. But the political mood is subdued. Sayasat, as Jamilia, an elderly mother of 4 grown children, commented as we waited together at the village taxi rank, commented, just divides people. She wouldn't be voting, she confided. One neighbour wants you to vote one way because they've got a brother who's working in the Stab. Another says vote for Atajurt, one of the leading political parties, because their people are from the south. She sucked her cheeks as she commented under her breath before hastily switching subjects. The topic was clearly one she didn't want to discuss further. For prominent members of Chichme's Tajik minority, such as this chap here, who was an administrative director in Chichme's Tajik medium school, the election carried an extra burden of scrutiny. Ikram was a member of his village council, but was seething when I met him about an incident that had occurred a couple of days earlier. The school's authorising, its sports hall, which doubled as a meeting house and a polling station, was being appropriated by the regional administration for a multiple of pre-election trainings, messing, as he put it, with the school's timetable. They treat it as though it was their property, he complained. When he asserted, politely but firmly, his pupils' right to conduct their sports lessons in peace, he had been given a public dressing down by the deputy governor of the regional administration in front of his colleagues. Elections are important, the deputy governor had told him, and so is my pupil's education, Ikrom had replied. And then, of course, they tell me to curb my temper, to calm myself. So do my colleagues. But they're stirring things up with this election, he said. Ikrom was also being pressed upon as a respected member of his community to mobilise the vote for particular candidates. The previous day he had gone to one of the local roadside shops, in fact the cafe that's just on the edge of that photo there, to drink coffee and eat a snack with his colleagues between classes. The owner had gently refused his attempts to pay. On leaving the shop, however, the man who had served the coffee, the delegated village campaign manager for one of the main opposition parties, teased Ikrom with the comment, "Don't forget whose coffee you've just drunk." Although couched as a gentle joke, Ikrom interpreted this comment from someone, he said, who wasn't even a friend, just an acquaintance, a local, as a thinly veiled demand for political loyalty, a prospective buying of his vote through an ostensibly generous gesture of coffee and cake. Ikrom was irate. He didn't immediately respond to the gesture, aware of the pressure of his older colleagues and bound by a sense of deference towards them to avoid demonstrative acts of opposition. The next day, however, after teaching 3 classes, he bought a jar of Nescafe, not an inconsequential purchase on his teacher's salary, and slammed it down demonstratively on the shop counter in this cafe-turned-election office, announcing pointedly to the person who had tried to bribe him the previous day, "Here's the coffee that I drank yesterday. Don't think I'll sell you my vote." These 2 examples from 2 villages in Batken region 10 years apart are striking for the way in which an election figures discursively as a particularly consequential and prospectively divisive public exercise, one that can make otherwise muted social divisions the object of intense popular investment. Here, in Spencer's evocation of the deeply embodied sense of there being too much antagonism in pre-referendum Scotland, we have the discomfort of too much politics, as Ikrom put it, of antagonisms being whipped about and charging through the social fabric with unpredictable consequences. In each case, we also have a sense that the ballot itself is, if not a sham, then inadequate to capture the variety of interests that are circulating in society and the personalisation of the state by those in power. It's significant in this respect that it was similar fears over the co-optation of democracy by partisan interests that had underpinned calls for the constitutional change of 2010. After 2 revolutions in 5 years and the ousting of President Bakiev, the hope invested in the rewriting of the constitution in 2010 by the ad hoc provisional government and its unlikely leader, Rozotenbayeva, was precisely that by changing from a presidential to a parliamentary system, the antagonisms that had been manifest on the street might be contained within the political process itself, that the constitution, in other words, might refound the rule of law. In 2010, the primary concern of the provisional government in rewriting the constitution was to prevent a counter-coup by supporters of the ousted president or other members of the presidential political party. But it was also more fundamentally an experiment in refounding constitutional order in a context of legal exception. The 2010 referendum had included 3 motions bundled into a single vote. A yes vote would mandate simultaneously to approve the draft constitution and the law on its enactment, to confirm Rozotenbayeva as interim president, and to dismiss the judges of the Constitutional Court. But refounding law in this way, when one's very claim to govern is not yet recognised in international law, is a messy and complex business. The provisional government, after all, had popular legitimacy in 2010, but no juridical foundation. One of the interim government's first acts, Provisional Government Decree number 8, and the language here is significant, which occurred a day after Bakiev was overthrown, was to issue a resolution, a постановление, indicating that its decrees would henceforth have normative force, an act that was itself illegal according to the 2009 law on normative acts. This was followed by decrees dissolving Parliament and disbanding the Constitutional Court, the only institution mandated to oversee the constitutionality of legal acts. Further decrees, numbers 19 and 20, mandated the holding of a referendum and stated that the constitutional laws would guide the administration of the constitutional referendum unless they contradicted the provisional government's own decrees. The OSCE noted rather obliquely in its report on the constitutional referendum that this was a vote in which, quotes, the legal framework for the constitutional referendum failed to fully regulate the process. This was an emphatic understatement. The provisional government was governing by decree in a state of emergency. Appealing to the will of the people was both necessary and inevitable, for this was the only source of authority left in the absence of a legally recognised government. But for all of the provisional government's appeals to people's democracy, народная демократия, the people of Kyrgyzstan was emphatically not cohesive. For weeks, Kyrgyzstan was effectively living in a state of emergency, with the ultimate source of legitimate authority contested locally between supporters of the ousted president, supporters of the interim government, and supporters of local governors who often acted as the de facto sovereign in their region of jurisdiction. Control of local mayoral offices changed hands repeatedly during these first weeks of power, and the justice was often very rough indeed. More worrying still, between June the 10th and June the 14th, just 2 weeks before the constitutional referendum was due to be held, the provisional centres of Osh and Jalalabad were racked by violence which polarised cities along lines of ethnicity and residence, leaving hundreds killed and tens of thousands displaced from their homes. In this fraught setting, the 2010 referendum took on colossal significance, even and perhaps especially because there was so little uncertainty over whether it could be held at all. Thousands of Kyrgyzstani Uzbeks who had fled their homes in Osh and Jalalabad were still sheltering in refugee camps in Uzbekistan on the date scheduled for the referendum. Others were too terrified to leave homes and barricaded mahallas to take part in a vote. This was an inauspicious moment then to be conjuring up the people. And yet for Kyrgyzstani citizens, the vote was a moment of explicit and ritualised refounding of the polity and freighted with existential significance. It did more or less achieve what it set out to do, formalising the provisional government as the single uncontested governing authority, and refounding the constitution itself as the foundational text of law. The official turnout of 72% and a 90.55% vote in favour of the referendum was almost certainly inflated. Nonetheless, the 2010 referendum succeeded materially and symbolically as a moment of constitutional refounding. In a situation where the state faced a real threat of civil war, the referendum conjured a momentary and fragile we, a people who, as a provisional singularity, were able to reauthorize democratic politics and reground the constitution as the urtext of political life. It's in this context, I think, that we need to understand then the post-revolutionary exhaustion that has characterized Kyrgyzstan's third decade of independence, and the widely held sense that the country, as Venera had put it, had had enough of politics. The 2010 referendum had helped contain a political crisis and refound the constitution as the basis of state law. Indeed, it was quite possibly what helped in the crisis-filled summer of 2010 to avert a descent into further violence. the provisions internal to the document to prevent constitutional changes for a further 10 years reflected that concern, as did the prayerful reverence with which the 2010 Constitution was treated in public discourse. But the sense that the political was intrinsically volatile, that divisions might once more go coursing through society, pitching neighbour against neighbour, as had occurred in 2010, was never far from the surface, particularly in villages like Ikroms here, which are ethnically polarised between Tajik and Kyrgyz communities. That's why subsequent political initiatives, including the attempted amendments of 2016, elicited such an outcry, why a movement against a referendum should have such popular appeal. Tinkering with the constitution, as one Bishkek analyst commented in 2017, was like playing with fire. Indeed, it's striking that when the parliamentary elections that were held in Kyrgyzstan here in 2015, for the first time since those upheavals of 2010 occurred, the greatest achievement, according to the then president, Almazbek Atambayev, was that they had been held, quote, without a single demonstration, without a single person protesting. After the intense turmoil of the preceding years, the greatest ambition for the election was that it would pass almost unnoticed by the voting public and the outside world. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Democracy, in particular the putative global crisis of democracy, has gained new attention as an object of anthropological inquiry in recent years. While much of the sociological and political science literatures on democracy has been concerned with normative questions of democratic success and failure, measured through rates of civic participation, tallies of regime type, or indices of political outcomes, anthropologists have tended to explore democracy instead within matrices of sociality and ethics, that is, as a form of practice and ideal that is necessarily both historically embedded and freighted with normative expectations of what participatory politics is or could be. The case of Kyrgyzstan's recent electoral history is instructive, I suggest, for thinking ethnographically about the complex relationship between such political investment and political disavowal. For non-participation, as much as participation itself, is also an ethical claim, a claim not to be corrupted or compromised, not to be complicit in an action that is not in one's name, not to be taken in by fakes, as Viniera had put it. Disavowal, then, is also a political act. To disavow is not simply to resist, but to cut a relation, as Inkrom had emphatically done by returning the politically loaded gift of coffee that was offered at election time. The example explored here also provides an opening for considering the particular kinds of tensions intrinsic to the political form of the referendum. For referendums are very particular kinds of ballots. In part, this is because they're typically invoked to decide foundational political decisions, to keep the constitution or to change it, to accept a peace deal or to reject it, to pool sovereignty or to take back control. The efficacy of the referendum lies precisely in its claim to demonstrate the unmediated will of the people in binary form, irrespective of how close the outcome or how polarised the preceding debate. They are, in that sense, the ultimate political vehicles for legitimising foundational acts, such as binding peace treaties, as we saw in Colombia, or constitutional change by appeal to a sovereign national will. Referendums, more than other democratic acts, have this capacity to cut the network, in Madeleine Reeves' terms, to mark a temporal break, to refound the political order. In Kyrgyzstan, this is precisely what made the 2010 referendum so efficacious, despite deep political crisis. But it's for this very same reason, I think, that referendums can also prove so contentious, so liable to dismissal as fakes, so shot through with the awareness of being straitjacketed into a choice that isn't really a choice at all. These features make the referendum the political tool par excellence of authoritarian populisms, the vehicle through which to normalise a contested seizure of territory, to extend presidential terms, as occurred in Kazakhstan, for instance, to expand executive powers, or to bypass parliamentary elections. One scholar of international law recently warned, for instance, that the precedent set by the 2014 referendum in Crimea, that quotes, "The referendum is likely to remain a potential trump card to which nationalists will appeal to overcome both constitutional impediments and the black hole of international law in the path towards statehood," end of quote. Yet merely to recognise that referendums can be manipulated by political elites is perhaps to buy too readily into the kind of sleight of hand that they seem to enact. For as complex and contingent socio-technical forms, referendums are also indeterminate. Their outcome is never entirely knowable. It's this volatility, I suggest, that makes them particularly interesting anthropological objects. For referendums rupture the normal socio-material field, creating the opportunity for a moment of collective political diagnosis in which the figure of the people acquires a sudden shimmering intensity, exposing in that moment the artifice at the heart of all sovereign claims. It's this intensity that can produce the efficacy of the referendum, its capacity drastically to change a political order, to authorise a government as legitimate, to sanctify a seizure of territory, to restore normal politics, as occurred in 2010 in Kyrgyzstan after 5 years of political upheaval and a spring of unprecedented political violence. It's this that can constitute an awareness of peoplehood as an effervescent and potentially powerful subject of politics. But it's also this very moment of conjuring that can foster a sense of politics as the field par excellence of the sanctioned lie, of the choice being a fake, or the institution itself being unable to contain the volatile forces that it sets in motion. For referendums exposed to public scrutiny, not just the tension between democracy as an ideal, the people shall govern themselves, and democracy as a messy, compromised, mediated reality. Do you prefer unsatisfactory option A or unsatisfactory option B? Referendums also shed a rare spotlight on that fickle, necessarily elusive and exclusive, and emphatically non-unanimous thing, the people, who, as a fictive singularity, is used to ground the state's political sovereignty. It's this very challenge of foundationality, I think, the prompt towards a meta-reflection on the messy, compromised, improvised, and all too human political processes through which sovereignty gets done, that makes these political acts at once good for thinking with about the state of contemporary democracy, and which makes them necessarily saturated with the suspicion of being not quite what they seem. Thank you.